Good evening and welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Joel Berkowitz. I'm the director of the Salmon Hallenstall Center for Jewish Studies here at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And it is my great pleasure to invite you to this year's Faye Sigman Woman of Valor lecture, given by my colleague Jessica Kirzane from the University of Chicago. And she'll be speaking tonight on translating and recovering Miriam Karpilove, Yiddish authoress. A few words of thanks and greetings and introduction, and then I'll bring our speaker up. First of all, thank you to our co-sponsors, UWM's Creative Writing Program and my very own Department of English, as well as the Departments of Translating and Interpreting Studies and Women's and Gender Studies. Thanks also to Jay Piney and Josh Yang from Classroom Services for their very valuable tech support, to my Deputy Director of the Stahl Center, Rachel Baum, and to Susan Wade for not only helping make this evening's event possible, but also for doing really just masterful work over many months, helping to coordinate the logistics of the fourth Milwaukee workshop of the Digital Yiddish Theater Project, of which I am a co-founder with my colleague Deborah Kaplan from Baruch College, CUNY in New York. And we have colleagues here from the DYTP from as far as Israel, the Netherlands, the UK, and Vancouver, as well as across the United States. And it's just a thrill to have these friends and colleagues here with us for this very special occasion. A few important notes about how this evening will work. We are doing this. This is the new way to do things in the Stahl Center whenever possible. This is a hybrid event, so welcome to our online audience as well. There is an opportunity to ask questions using the Q&A area of Zoom. So if you have questions at any point in the talk, feel free to drop them into the Q&A. Rachel Baum will be monitoring that, and we will use our special secret signals to wave to each other, and she can convey any of those to me during the Q&A. Of course, the live audience here is welcome to ask questions as well. We have, for the live audience, feedback cards that we always use at our events that should be on your chair or near it. And we welcome you to fill out, even my colleagues from the DYTP. We like to encourage people to do that by offering the opportunity to win a prize. The obvious prizes related to this evening event are the two translations of Miriam Karpilove's novels that have been published so far. And of course, we'll be hearing more about those in a moment. And so there'll be opportunity for two lucky winners who turn in their cards to receive those. The Faye Sigman Woman of Valor event is an annual one that long predates my time here, which started in 2010, and has brought a string of very distinguished lecturers to the university, to just name a few off the top of my head. And that's with apologies to all of the others out there, but Hasia Diner, Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblett, our own Lisa Silverman here at UWM, Deborah Dash Moore, Jill Dolan, and the list goes on and on and on back quite a few years. So we are very proud of this series. The series was established by the late Bud and Lee Temkin, the late Royal Taxman and his wife, Myra Taxman, and was just talking to Myra a moment ago. She unfortunately can't be with us here in person tonight, but she is here with us, I believe, out there on Zoom. So good evening, Myra. Good evening to anyone else in the Taxman and Temkin families who are with us. We're so grateful for the ongoing gifts that have made this series possible, that have made it possible to enrich this campus and the local community with all of the great lectures that we have brought here. And although I never had the honor and pleasure of meeting Myra and Lee's mother, Faye Sigman, I have gotten to hear many wonderful stories about her over the years. And I know that where Myra and Lee grew up in Appleton, Wisconsin. Oh, thank you. Rachel's reminding me that we We have Faye Greenberg Sigman's picture right here, and happy to present that to you. Myra and Lee grew up in a household where Faye Greenberg Sigman fostered a love of learning, of culture, of Yiddishkeit, and of Menschlichkeit. And although I never got to meet Bud Temkin, who passed away before I came to Milwaukee, I did develop a very warm rapport with Lee and with Royal, and that continues with Myra and to down the generations. And I know from the living examples, the kind of example that Faye Sigman set, and I have a feeling that she would be especially proud and pleased that we have Jessica Kirzane with us tonight. I know that this would be a topic that would be very close to her heart, as it will to her successors. Let me say a few words about Jessica. Jessica Kirzane is the Assistant Instructional Professor of Yiddish at the University of Chicago. Her scholarship focuses on representations of race and gender in American Yiddish literature, and her academic writing has appeared in a number of journals and edited collections. Jessica is also a literary translator whose translations have been published in Jewish Currents, Columbia Journal, Pakenträger, and elsewhere. She is the translator of 3 works by Miriam Karpilove, Diary of a Lonely Girl or The Battle Against Free Love, Judith, A Tale of Love and Woe, and the not yet but very imminently published A Provincial Newspaper and Other Stories, which is forthcoming from Syracuse University Press. Jessica was a 2017 Translation Fellow and a 2018 Pedagogy Fellow at the Yiddish Book Center. She earned her PhD in Yiddish Studies from Columbia University in 2017. She was pedagogy editor of the online Yiddish Studies journal in geveb, and since 2018 has served as the editor-in-chief of our beloved sister website in geveb, which she also graced us with a very interesting talk about this afternoon. I'll just add that this sort of interesting event in lots of ways, including that Jessica was here a few years ago talking about related subjects. It was mid-March 2020. People may remember, if they can get through the fog of the last few years, what a strange time that was. We were a little bit unsure whether to go ahead with the event. We did, terribly fearful of one another as being potential repositories of all sorts of deadly germs. But we got through that night and enjoyed having Jessica here. But this is a wonderful opportunity to bring her back under closer to normal circumstances, if not entirely normal. And it's just a pleasure to have you back here. And I'm very happy to bring up our speaker, Jessica Kirzane.
Thank you so much, Joel, and thank you for the invitation. It's really such an honor. I see already that there's a typo on this. It is not April 27th, so don't be confused by the date. Miriam Karpilove, who was born in 1888 and died in 1956, was a prolific Yiddish writer and editor known for her sharp, sardonic gaze on the world of Yiddish and its sexism. I've been reading and translating her work for several years now, and I'm here to tell you about her life and her writing because it is gutsy, fiercely independent, and funny, and strikingly modern and fresh, even 100 years later. I'm going to walk you through her life, and as I do, I will stop and tell you about some of her writing in greater detail, giving you a bit of a whirlwind tour of Bohemian Yiddish New York popular fiction in the early 20th century. But before I do that, I want to start from the end of Karpilove's life and to think with you about legacy and about recovery. Because there's a certain extent that Miriam Karpilove has arrived through my translations into some new prominence in Yiddish literary history, but that arrival is a delayed one. Karpilove was widely published and read in her own lifetime, but even by the time her literary production had slowed in her later years, there was virtually no mention of her in literary histories or literary criticism. This, I believe, was the result of two overlapping factors, gender and genre. In Karpilove's archive, which is housed at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research in New York, one can find two handwritten lists by Karpilove of every single work she ever published, as though she had expected some scholar to come back to her at some later date, knowing that she was crucial to understanding the history of American Yiddish literature. One of these lists is written on stationery on which is printed the words Miriam Karpilove, Authoress. Elsewhere, on the cover of one of her scrapbooks, one can find an image of Miriam Karpilove clipped from a newspaper with the label Miriam Karpilove, die berühmte Schriftstellerin, the famous woman writer. But what does it mean to be a famous woman writer, a famous authoress? An authoress is not merely an author with a feminine gender identity. An authoress is a term that comes with particular connotations. It is a writer who conforms to expectations about the form and subject for what women write. Writing about women, writing in ways that emphasize her own experiences as a woman, and with a special emphasis on love. Writing that is, in a word, womanly, of a lower status, or what we might call middle brow. This genre of literature, the middle brow, is characterized by its orientation toward the present moment, its immediacy, which may not lend itself to lasting legacy. Middle brow is at once a pejorative term used to look down on reading produced for pleasure rather than the more male-coded philosophically or formally challenging highbrow. And it is also a type of writing that, as Nicola Humble, a scholar of middle brow writing, explains, works to both distinguish itself from and straddle the divide between trashy romance or lowbrow and the highbrow, quote, gleefully mocking intellectual pretensions. In Karpilove's case, such writing often meant entering into a literary battle of the sexes, in which the middlebrow writer, the authoress, used humor to punch up at and ridicule the male literary establishment. It's no wonder, then, that she was easily written out of literary histories that would rather not be plagued by the attention she gave to the hypocrisy of male intellectuals, editors, writers, and lovers that Karpilove encountered in her lifetime as the famous Yiddish authoress. To take an example of the kind of text that made Karpilove so entertaining in her own lifetime, but might have contributed to her becoming so quickly forgotten after her death, a few years ago, I published a translation of an unpublished humorous sketch by Karpilove. The translation appeared in the Digital Yiddish Theater Project, which is a resource consortium and digital humanities project founded by Joel Berkowitz and Deborah Kaplan. And many of those here today are part of this group. The sketch, titled Theater, is undated, but presumably, given its content, was written in the 1940s after Karpilove had moved into something like retirement, leaving the Yiddish literary world of New York to live with her brother in Bridgeport, Connecticut. The sketch offers a window into Karpilove's struggles as a woman in the male-dominated world of Yiddish literature and culture, problems that she explores consistently in her published writing and in her personal correspondence. These problems include expectations about the appropriate genres and subjects for women's writing, domestic, romance, as well as male editors and here directors not taking her work seriously or looking to take advantage of her. The story is at once about the business of theater and is about the theatrical nature of modern Yiddish culture in America, which appears to only be acting as though all is well, while Jews in Europe are living out atrocities. That is to say, it starts out with a critique about the treatment of women writers, but is ultimately an even broader critique of the kind of culture that male cultural producers propagate, gender aside. In the story, Karpilove uses her biting wit and her signature ironic tone, a tone she employs in most of her published work across genres, to depict Yiddish theater and Yiddish culture in America in general as an insincere and irrelevant sham that cannot appropriately speak to the urgencies of its moment. I'll read you an excerpt in my translation in which a Yiddish woman writer pitches a play about partisans, resistance fighters during the Holocaust, to a producer and director of Yiddish theater who want to take the play for free, but then utterly transform it into the kind of entertainment they feel will be lucrative. She had a captivating voice, calm and gentle, that stroked and rocked them to sleep. Seeing the effect of her voice was having on them, she raised it higher and louder. She played the role of the heroine. The partisans in the forest were asleep and didn't see the danger. The murderous Nazis were approaching. The heroine, the heroic partisan, cried out, "Wake up! Wake up! You have to get up! They're coming! Shoot! Shoot!" She was so absorbed in the role that she seemed to have frightened herself with her screams. Even more than she, the men who were listening to her were startled. They leapt to their feet and their eyes darted around the room. Huh? What? Where's the fire? What happened? The whole world is on fire, the playwright lamented in a tragic voice. The whole world is on fire, and we're asleep. Hearing her answer, they calmed down. They exchanged glances, and then they asked her to keep reading. She read on. In order to prove to her that they weren't asleep, they interrupted her with questions that only served to demonstrate that they had no idea what her skit was about. What happens next? Asked the star director. What happens after he forces her against a wall? What happens with the courtesan? You mean the partisan? She corrected him. Oh, yes, the partisan. She bears his child, doesn't she? No. Why not? Because she refuses. That's a shame. A child creates such pathos. It can really liven up a play. It's what audiences like. And it's a good place to add some music, asserted the musical director. You can have a lullaby or a lament. And what about a dance number in the forest after they beat their enemies, huh? This isn't an operetta or a burlesque, the playwright cried. It's a tragedy, a memorial to the victims, to the martyrs, to all those who were killed. She was overcome with emotion and couldn't say any more. She finished reading. She sat exhausted. She silently wet her lips. The musical director did too. The star director removed his hands, which he had placed over his eyes, and wiped his brow. Well, he said. I see that it's a current events piece. Not bad, not bad. There's, of course, room for improvements. The forest, the concentration camp, Nazis and courtesans, partisans. Oh yes, partisans, lady partisans, and male ones too. Men, women, and children, like young trees in a forest full of murderers and thieves. What an image! Captivating, colossal, stupendous. I think the passage is fascinating for a number of reasons, but what I want to stop and notice is that this is a piece that, to my knowledge, never found a publisher. Not only was the story forgotten to literary history, it was never even known in the first place. To be an authoress, then, at least for Karpilove, was to have an experience of writing in which your work was underpaid and undervalued, writing under demeaning demands that the topics be less earnest and more sexy, with know-it-all editors who were eager to improve the story, to meet their expectations for it, and sometimes to not be published at all. My task as a translator has been to expose these circumstances by researching Karpilove herself and all her writing about the conditions of her labor, a consistent topic of hers, and to write the record of Yiddish literary history by reinscribing Karpilove's place in it in a way that was denied to her in her own lifetime, as it was for so many other women writers. And so there are two layers in the feminism of my translation work. On the one hand, Miriam Karpilove's work was engaged with representing the contradictions and challenges of women's romantic and working lives, and my translation reproduces that work for new readers. That's one layer, and one that probably I'll mostly focus on for this talk, but there's a broader context also, one about literary recovery in the face of erasure. Despite her prolific output in the Yiddish press, Karpilove's obituary in Der Tag, a newspaper for which she had served as one of the founding writers, is very spare. It describes her as having written novels for newspapers without giving titles or the names of the publications, and explains that she stood close to the Zionist labor movement without detailing the nature of her political involvement. The sparsity of information available in publications, her work received almost no critical attention in her lifetime or thereafter, has left me to rely on her personal archive and letters, as well as her published work, including her fiction, to reconstruct her life and career. This is typical for women who wrote in Yiddish and often for women's writing in general, which is undervalued in its own time and therefore harder to find, read, and learn about today. This is what makes my translation work something other than bringing a text admired in one language to an audience who wishes to access it in another, something we might more typically think of as the task of the translator. For instance, what an English translator of Tolstoy or Flaubert might be doing. Rather, it is a work of literary recovery that helps to set the record straight about women who wrote in Yiddish, that they existed, that they wrote valuable and interesting works of literature, This translation is part of a veritable wave of translations and scholarship that are now making it all but impossible to think of Yiddish literature as a field occupied solely by men. Though little more than a decade ago, syllabi of Yiddish literature were likely to include only a handful of female identifying poets, if they included women at all. It also joins a broader effort toward feminist literary recovery beyond Yiddish, the strength of which relies, as literary critic Joanna Skutz explains, not with the return of a single neglected voice, but with a chorus. This slide shows just a handful of some of the recent translations of women who wrote in Yiddish. And there are many things missing from this slide. All of this has been, forgive me, a very long preface to the substance of my talk, which is to walk you through Miriam Karpilove's life and interweave her writing into that biographical sketch. So let me back up a bit. Karpilove was born near Minsk in what is now Belarus and was then in the Russian Empire, among the middle children in a family of 10 children. I've given you a picture of a small town in the Minsk Governorate. I don't know that is her town. I actually don't know the name of the town where she was born, but just to kind of give a sense. Little is known about Miriam Karpilove's life prior to emigrating. Some facts can be interpolated. She was certainly well educated. She wrote in Russian prior to her turn to Yiddish in the US. We have some sort of teenage writing of hers in Russian. And she was trained as a photographic retoucher as a teenager. She, along with several of her siblings, was very actively involved in the Poale Zion labor Zionist movement in Minsk and later in the US. Karpilove emigrated to the US in 1905. Likely as a result of the political turmoil in Minsk. She settled in Bridgeport, Connecticut, alongside several of her brothers, and later lived in Harlem and in the Seagate neighborhood of Brooklyn. She had a large family of siblings and cousins in the United States, and this formed the backbone of her social network and support system throughout her life. These are just some cool pictures of Miriam Karpilove. She was very photographable. Karpilove's first published work appeared in print in 1906, shortly after her immigration, in a newspaper called Yiddish Fun when she was 18 years old. Karpilove started her career out publishing a handful of pieces, short stories and sketches in newspapers. Her first real success as a writer was her 1909 play, In die Sturm Tag, which is about a Jewish family during the 1905 revolution. That play was performed by the Yiddish Volksbühne in New York in 1912 and later also by a Polish youth organization, Zukunft, in the 1920s. She also published a novel in 1911, Judith, which was written as a series of letters from a small town young Jewish woman to her lover, a revolutionary from a wealthy city family who she has only met in person on a handful of occasions. The novel follows the protagonist as she ultimately immigrates to America, still writing to her lover and never knowing if he's faithful. This is among the writing of hers that I've translated. My copy. So I'll read you an excerpt so that you can get a taste of it. It intermingles love, romance, and tragedy, excuse me, with reflections on the political context in which Judith finds herself, especially a skepticism toward Jewish participation in Russian revolutionary politics. So this is from one of the earliest letters in the collection, the second letter, April 15th, 1904. My Joseph, how I long to be beside you. I would comfort your fevered head with soft caresses and beg you to rest. Your parents won't force you to tie yourself down to a career or coerce you into marrying for money. No, they love you too much. You judge them too harshly. Why can't you understand that they want to keep you with them out of love for you and not give you up to me? Oh, you wonderful, capricious boy. Do they know about me yet? You told them. You did. I understand, Joseph, everything that you didn't write. I understand how much they don't want me. They want a wealthy girl. To what end? They're wealthy enough themselves. In our small town, my family is considered among the most well-off. But compared to yours, no, there shouldn't be rich and poor. Everyone should be equal. Do you know what my father said yesterday? He said that one day you will be a famous man, a great public speaker. Do you remember that one time he was so taken by your speech that he grasped both of your hands and said, young man, we are very much in need of men like you. Older men like me look to young ones like you to carry on our work. But you need to be more careful with your words. We must guard our words in this land of spies and unrest. You stood there and didn't say anything. Everyone stopped talking. You looked into his eyes. Then you lifted your head and swore that you would defend our people to the death. How strong and handsome you were, Joseph. How moving it was to see the two of you united in one purpose. I wanted to hold you in both my arms and kiss you, but I was too shy. Why are we always ashamed to give way to our noblest feelings? Aaron is here. I'm sure he's talking about you. I will listen to what he has to say. So it gives you a sense of this kind of one-sided love that she explores. In 1914, Miriam Karpilove's writing career really appears to have taken off. She published frequently in satirical newspapers, offering jokes, witticisms, and sketches, including making fun of the leading Yiddish newspapers of the day. She started writing short stories and sketches for the newly founded literarily oriented newspaper Der Tag, as well as in other leading newspapers like Freie Arbeiterstimme and the Vorwärts. And these are the reason I included these cartoons is actually just to give you a sense of how recognizable she was as a literary figure, in that she appears in a number of different cartoons of literary culture. So in the cartoon, with all the people who look like they have their heads on matchsticks, I think this one is particularly interesting because she's the only woman who appears in this cartoon about writers. And then in the other one, she's the very tall woman. She was quite tall. And next to her, the short woman is Celia Dropkin. Although she would later devote herself entirely to her writing, in these early years, she worked as a retoucher in several different photography studios. Among some of her earliest journalism are descriptions of this work. Writing in a photography studio meant laboring all day in the dark with shuttered windows and no fresh air in a narrow room on an upper floor of a poorly ventilated building. Dark curtains hung over the window panes. In one large studio that Karpilove describes, there were tables in a circle in the middle of the studio, each table with 6 stands in a row for 6 retouchers. And there was one small electric lamp in the middle for them to share because, quote, the boss understood how to be economical. The camera operator would take the subject's portrait and then dip the glass in chemicals, dry it, and hand it to the retoucher. Using a sharp pencil, the retoucher would smooth out the imperfections on the subject's face, getting rid of their freckles or wrinkles. Karpilove writes, in a word, the photograph should look younger and prettier than the subject. The retoucher would paint the photographs with India ink, adding details such as the necklace a jealous woman spotted on her next-door neighbor, or removing shadows that had fallen over someone's face when the photograph was taken. Karpilove's writing about these tasks is sometimes quite funny. One customer complained, I'm missing 2 fingers. They're not missing, they're just bent. Well, paint them in, please. I won't accept a picture without fingers. But most of this writing is deadly serious. Describing the miserable working conditions, Karpilove explains, the workers looked more dead than alive after spending so much time in the dark, poorly maintained room. The floors were soaked in oil, gasoline, and kerosene. At any moment, they could go up in flame. There was no elevator, no fire escape, and the stairs were made of thin boards that creaked under your feet. Karpilove makes clear that while the work was backbreaking and eye-spoiling for workers of all stripes, women in the industry faced particular challenges. When she was at work as a retoucherin, or retoucherke, a woman retoucher in a photography studio, she was often the only woman in the room. This would also later be the case in the offices of the newspapers where she wrote. Karpilove describes the experience of going to work in a photography studio on 5th Avenue. They led me into a dark room full of men, and I felt as though I had fallen into a foreign land. I had never been alone with so many men before. They looked at me curiously with stolen glances, and one called out, "We have ourselves a girl." They made jokes and sexual innuendos and gave her a hard time for not laughing. They insulted her, quote, not only with their tongues, but with their hands and feet. One worker placed his leg closely against hers, no matter how often she scooted away or asked him to stop, to the amusement of the rest of the workers. Describing her anger, she writes, my pencil broke on the negative because my fist was so tightly clenched. Standing up, Karpilove lifted her chair and threatened, say another word and I'll break this chair over your head. Karpilove's writing about photography work displays some of the same sense of vulnerability and the same resilience and defiance that readers later came to expect from her writing about romance or about the world of journalism. When she began serializing Diary of a Lonely Girl in the newspaper Die Wahrheit in 1916, Karpilove finally was able to not only have the recognition of a wide audience, but also the stability of a regular income from her writing, And I'm not sure, but I suspect this marked the end of her time as a photography worker. Diary of a Lonely Girl is a first-person narrative about a woman's life navigating a treacherous dating scene in turn of the 20th century New York. The diary was one of Karpilove's most popular novels. It was serialized in Die Wahrheit in 1916 to 1918 and published in book form immediately after in 1918. And that's the picture of the original next to my translation. Karpilove's work, a first-person account of a single young woman's dating life in turn of the century New York, slyly attacks the economic and political inequities facing women. In doing so, it reveals the hypocrisies of societal expectations that the narrator be at once sexually available to free-thinking young men and maintain her respectability according to the mores of nosy landladies. The novel offers a raw, intimate, and personal criticism of radical urban Jewish society's complicity in fashioning a young woman's vulnerable circumstances. The narrator is struggling to figure out whether and how she can participate in a culture of free love in which she is undervalued, used, and discarded. Its insight and wit expose and critique the precarious status of women in radical Yiddish American youth culture during World War I. As Karpilove's narrator reveals, the idea of free love was part of a political context of liberatory anti-establishment thinking, including revolt against the religious and political authorities who supported the establishment of marriage. But concomitant with a politically left loosening of sexual mores came increased dangers of non-consensual sexual contact. Karpilove's narrator finds herself particularly vulnerable to young men's sexual advances because she is a young woman alone an ocean away from her family. She associates freely with young men without any parental supervision, and the only protection she has against their unwanted advances is her own quick thinking. Karpilove's novel reflects the excitement, anxieties, and intergenerational conflicts of the moment. Rather than reveling in their newfound freedoms, the book exposes the not-so-hidden dangers of women participating in a more sexually permissive youth culture. Karpilove demonstrates the double standards to which women are held even as they desire the status and economic stability of marriage while trying to navigate the uncharted dating scene that included extramarital and premarital affairs. It may not sound like it, but The Diary of a Lonely Girl is actually a very funny book. Although the narrator is stuck between a rock and a hard place, the way she wrestles free is by deprecating her landladies and lovers through her sharp wit on the pages of her diary. And we, the readers, benefit from her incessant eye-rolling. So I'll read you a short excerpt. This is an excerpt that happens. So the men in the diary are named A, B, C, D, and so forth. They don't have their own names. And this is an excerpt that happens with C, who takes up the vast majority of the book and is someone who likes to take quite a lot of room in general. So C proposed that we have a love affair. As long as I have no marriage prospects ahead of me, I should at least take whatever life offers me. Whatever bit of beauty I now possess will fade over time, and I'll regret that I didn't take everything life gave me. That's how he spoke to me, and I threw him out of my room for it. I didn't even scold him for talking that way. I listened to him, and I hated him for it. My hatred gave me an odd sort of strength to hear him out. I didn't even let him see that I hated him, but when he took my silence as assent and wanted to move on from words of propaganda to practical actions, I calmly showed him the door as though he'd asked me for directions. You don't mean it, he said with a skeptical smile. Leave my room. But you know, you can't drive me away like that. I'm not driving you away. I'm asking you to leave. But why? You listened to me so patiently all the way to the end. Surely you must be joking. You came here with a bargain in mind, a sale. You wanted to cheapen me in my own eyes so that you could get me more easily. I listened to you devalue my worth, but I found that it would cost me too much. And so I am not for sale. Go look for some other wares. You can be so cutting, so severe. I didn't mean it that way. No need to say anything. I don't care whether you meant it or not. We won't be making any deals. Go. He looked at me, biting his lip. He grabbed his hat, reached for the door, and slammed it behind him. He still thought he was in the right. The novel itself was widely popular. One way I know this is simply the fact that after the novel was serialized, it was published in book form. And as a result, Karpilove became a regular contributor to Die Wahrheit, the Ladies' Garment Worker, and other New York papers. The diary was her first foray into writing serialized novels, which was to become a specialty of hers. As early as 1917, before the diary appeared in book form, Karpilove had already begun her second serialized novel, Die Verführte, about a woman who was led astray. She continued publishing short stories, reportage, and serialized novels in Die Wahrheit until 1920, when her situation appears to have become more tenuous. In a letter dated 1920, she writes to Ab Khan, the editor-in-chief of the Forwards, asking him to take her on as a staff writer, and she explains it as a matter of some urgency to her. This letter, together with her dwindling appearance in Die Wahrheit, suggests that her role as a regular contributor to that newspaper was coming to an end. But Khan didn't hire Karpilove, and she continued to pitch her work one piece at a time to the Yiddish press. In 1925, she left New York for Boston in search of work, where she records that she published about 50 editorials for a newspaper that she found to be provincial and that did nothing to bolster her reputation or readership. As a result, she published her slapstick-style novel, A Provincial Newspaper, about a woman writer and editor who is hired as a staff writer for a poorly managed provincial newspaper and is exploited and ill-treated. One might assume that there's some autobiographical content in the novel, though it appears to have been exaggerated for comic effect. Stay tuned. This is part of my next book of translations. And here's a little bit of an excerpt, a teaser. The first issue of The Pathfinder. At the top, front and center, in large, bold font, were the words, "Start reading the exciting, wonderful, interesting, and realistic novel, Both of the Sexes, by the famous and beloved grand authoress and member of the editorial staff of the Yiddish Pathfinder." My name followed, "Today." And then another advertisement. "Read the editorial by our own very great authoress, written especially for the Pathfinder." After that, in bold font, the editorial itself appeared, and then my picture, over which and under which were a description of all the marvelous things that the great authoress will write in the future. Then there was an invitation to write to her for advice about family life, children, love, misfortunes with love, of course, no one has questions about happy love, and anything else. She will answer any question. Write the question clearly and legibly on one-sided paper and send it to the address printed below for the women's pages of the newspaper. You won't regret it. How nice, a substantial advertisement, but it was a bit much. I looked at the newspaper and looked at the others who were also looking at it. The office girls exchanged meaningful glances and smiled kindly at me. One of them came up to me and asked if I was happy. The whole paper is taken up with me. I am so important. Everyone is talking about me. They say I must earn a lot of money. Why, if I were so famous in an English newspaper, I'd be making a fortune. Why don't I write in English? I explained to her that English readers have enough writers. We have too few. If the English newspapers like my writing, they can translate it from Yiddish. I feel more at home in Yiddish. Yiddish is the language I love. But it doesn't pay, she retorted. She is the bookkeeper. She knows what she's talking about. She knows exactly how much money I'm earning. I find that unpleasant. But I say to her, money isn't everything. When I write in Yiddish, I'm helping in the development of the Yiddish language, and that is more important than... Is Yiddish a language? She asked. And quickly offered her own answer, that she didn't know, since she didn't know any Yiddish. None of the office staff know any Yiddish. The whole newspaper is as incomprehensible as if it were written in Chinese. They brought it home to see if one of their parents could read it for them and tell them what it's about. Aside from the Russian-speaking intellectuals, the English-speaking ones, for whom the newspaper should be near to their hearts, are actually far from interested. The former aren't interested in the newspaper because they don't like it, the latter because they don't understand it. So who will read it? Who are we publishing for? There wasn't enough time to settle the question of how the newspaper would be read. All of my time was devoted to writing it. The novel, the editorials, and everything we needed until the newspaper can stand on its own 2 feet. All of the editorial tasks, large and small, that were needed to fill its empty columns. A new daily newspaper with few advertisements needs a lot of material for publishing, and when the entire editorial staff consists of 3 people, not only do they have to edit their own selections, they have to write the whole thing themselves. After leaving the Boston newspaper, with no opportunities for stable employment on the immediate horizon, Miriam Karpilove left for Palestine, together with her brother and his wife, hoping that she could live there and write about her experiences for the American Yiddish press. She appears to have received a verbal commitment from Der Tag that her work would find a home in that newspaper, and she was later disappointed in their lack of interest. She writes to the Forwards from Palestine asking them to consider her work, and she writes to her friend, Rose Bachelus Schomer, asking for help in finding someone who will publish her writing so that she can stay in Palestine and live off her writing income. A devoted Zionist, she wanted to remain in Tel Aviv, but she couldn't sustain her career there, and she returned to America in 1929. I recently translated an excerpt from her unpublished memoir about her time in Palestine. And what's most striking to me about it is that even in her writing about this adventurous journey across the sea to settle in Palestine, what she focuses on are the quotidian details of her life and the absurdities of them, turning her attention more closely to the bed bugs that attack her as she's staying in a domed room on the roof of a Tel Aviv hotel than to a straightforward discussion of political ideology. And yet, this level of detail and humor has the effect of deflating lofty ideological commitments. Even though Karpilove remained a labor Zionist throughout her life, she seems to have done so with a healthy dose of skepticism. This is an example of a needlepoint that Karpilove did of a Palestinian scene. And I will just say that she was also quite a textile artist. I have in my possession several of her needlepoints that her niece gave me. In 1930, her writing career in New York seems to have picked up somewhat, and she published several novels and short stories, but without a sustained source of income or reliable publishing opportunities. It appears that she also tried to break into English language publishing at this time, self-translating to seek new audiences, but with no success. It took her a while to land on her feet, but eventually Karpilove was hired as a staff writer for the Yiddish newspaper, the Forwards, in 1934, and that was another major break for her. She once again had a steady income as a writer, and for several years she published novels, short stories, and observations in that paper. Often the subjects of these stories were older women, divorcees, and widows, the sorts of people who may have been the readers of the newspaper, but who one might not often see as subjects of literary fiction. In 1938, she left the Forwards to go to Bridgeport, Connecticut to take care of her brother Jacob and his ailing wife, Rebecca. And after Rebecca's death and facing her own health issues, Karpilove continued to live in Bridgeport. Although her letters to her friends demonstrate that she disliked living there and felt removed from the lively world of Yiddish letters that she was used to inhabiting. A short story by Miami-based Yiddish writer Telgush about Karpilove in this period describes her as a has-been Yiddish writer, unfulfilled by her provincial life in Bridgeport, though she herself disliked this description and denied its veracity. She continued to publish intermittently. The last publication I was able to find of hers is dated 1945. Until her death in 1956, she maintained a correspondence with many friends in the Yiddish writing world and wrote of her plans to publish her collected works, to improve and publish several novels, and to write her own life story, but also expressed frustration that her poor health made it difficult to realize these projects. This is an excerpt from a letter that she wrote to Rose Bachelus Schomer in 1955, the year before she died, in which she talks about some of these projects that she hopes still to do. In some ways, Karpilove's story is one of remarkable success. This tenacious woman used her sharp, sarcastic pen to win her fame and financial independence, despite women having fewer opportunities within the Yiddish press. The diary is a primary example of this success because it was so widely read and enjoyed. In some ways, however, Karpilove's story is about her need to scramble, her concern and even anger about lack of interest in her writing, and ultimately about her obscurity as her writing lay largely unread and unexamined after her death, despite its popularity in her own lifetime. But more and more, I think it's also a story about the long literary life of a writer, the way that legacies can grow and change depending on who happens to turn their attention to a writer, who reads, translates, writes about, and cares about a writer, which is to say, Karpilove's story has extended into a story about me and my career in literary recovery. And it's also a story about you as people who are learning about Karpilove and integrating her life and work into how you understand Yiddish literary history, American literary history, and simply what it means to be defiant, feisty, and skeptical in the face of life's absurdities. It's my hope that my own translation work will help to restore Karpilove to her proper place within the story of American Jewish literature, and that in reading her, scholars will also discover a fuller sense of how difficult it was to write about and largely for women in a publishing world run by men. Here's some more wonderful pictures of Miriam Karpilove, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Jessica, thank you so much. Such a fascinating figure and such a fascinating talk. I believe we don't have online questions yet, but if you are watching, do feel free to drop them in the Q&A. And in the meantime, questions from in the room. Zachary.
I do, yeah.
And actually, so just asked about, Zachary Baker asked about whether he thinks whether we think that the photographs may have been retouched, and we'll hand the mic around and so people can.
Remind people to type their questions into the Q&A rather than raising them.
Okay, and if you have questions out there in virtual land, please type them into the Q&A rather than what works in some kind of meetings is raising your hands, but we're not doing it that way tonight. So type them into the Q&A if you have questions. And meanwhile, we'll talk about retouching photos.
Yeah, so I don't know for sure if she retouched them, but they for sure were retouched. You can see that her lips are painted in the top photo. I have some photos where you can see her waist is cinched somewhat. And given that was among her skills and professions, it seems extremely likely that she did that. Yeah.
I have a question from Zoom. Did she ever have a great romance with anyone? Did she wish to have children? Great talk. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know the answer. I definitely know that she dated because I have at least a few letters where she talks about having gone on dates. One of them where she says she wished that she had stayed home and read instead, so it wasn't a very good date. So she certainly dated, but I don't know that she had any long sustained romances. I do also have some hints that she possibly also fancied women, but I don't know that with any certainty, just sort of like hints, which maybe explains the lack of clarity about her romantic relationships, because maybe there would have been less evidence. I also know that she was extremely, extremely close to her brother and to her sister-in-law, and in her old age lived with her brother in the fashion of almost a sort of couple where they would take care of each other and live together. So that is a different kind of love. But yes, she had many great loves in her life, but I don't know how many of them were romantic.
Here we go. Fabulous tech support delivers up a working mic. Here we go.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Amanda Seligman. I work outside this field altogether. So now everything I know, I learned from you. I want to ask a question that was based on the very last thing you said about sort of extending her story into the present through your own research and your story of you and the story of us. And I guess my question is an invitation for you to talk about the process of doing this research and your contact with her family. You implied connection with her niece, and I'm assuming these are personal photos to some extent. So would you just sort of tell us about how you went about doing the non-archival portions of this research?
Yeah. So I initially, when I started translating the diary, I didn't really know anything about Miriam Karpilove. I can't really remember why I felt I was in such a hurry, but I felt that I was in a tremendous hurry. I wanted to publish a book. And so I kind of put the idea of researching her as a person on the back burner and was just focusing on this text. But it wasn't, I had started writing the introduction to that text and trying to kind of put together at least a few flimsy details about what her life was. And at the same time, I had already started thinking about translating a provincial newspaper, which is coming out soon. And that was actually the next thing that I translated. And that was published in 1926. And so I was going to run into some issues with permissions. And so I needed to start looking for her family. So I actually, at the time, I couldn't travel to look in her archives because I had two very young children at home. So I sent a friend to go to the YIVO archives and look at family photographs and read the backs of family photographs and find the names and see if that would help me find this family. And basically, I did a lot of Googling of this last name until I found Miriam Karpilove, the younger, on Twitter. And I sent her a Twitter message and said, like, no, this is really random and weird, but like, do you happen to have a relative in the family who was a Yiddish writer? And it turns out that she did. It was her great aunt. And so that was the way that I first encountered this family. So her dad was the nephew of Miriam Karpilove, and had met her, and is probably, I think, one of the only people living who remembers her from the family. And he had quite a lot of family photographs. I think a lot of people seem to have had quite a lot of family photographs of Miriam Karpilove. My sense is, first of all, as she had a large family, she had a lot of cousins, and it seems like her way of keeping in touch included sending photographs of herself, probably because she had access to photography equipment. And so some of these are sort of postcard photographs. So he actually mailed me the physical original copies of the photographs. And I immediately sent them to the Yiddish Book Center and said, please digitize these for me, and then send them back to him because I don't want to be responsible. And so that was kind of like the beginning of the relationship. And we have been in touch on the phone, and I've sent them copies of the books, and they've been very generous and excited, and none of them read or speak Yiddish. And so this has been a way for them to access this writing too. And then very recently, just a few weeks ago, I happened to be visiting a friend in San Francisco, which is where Miriam Karpilove, the younger, lives. And I got to meet her, and the family gave me the original naturalization papers, Miriam Karpilove's original naturalization papers, which I now have hanging in my office framed. And it was just very warm. It's been very special to have this relationship. I feel like I am so close to Miriam Karpilove as a person. I feel like almost she has become sort of like an extended family member of mine. And I think this family sort of sensed that. And there's a real, I don't know, kinship that was created through this translation process.
Another question from online. Would the Volksbein Theater consider having a play written and produced about her? Possibly.
If they wanted to, I would be up for it. Yeah. They have a reading series about Yiddish women playwrights, and Karpilove's early 1909 play is being considered for that series. The play is quite interesting in that it sounds nothing like the rest of what Miriam Karpilove wrote. It's extremely serious and earnest. I think that she hadn't figured out yet that she was a humor writer, which seems to have been like what her groove was later on.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. This is wonderful. I was wondering, well, I guess a two-part question. The first question is, like, how did you discover her? And because I know you use a lot of newspapers in your research, so was it through newspapers? And the other question is, in terms of her place within Yiddish literature, like, how would you think about her style in relationship to the other Yiddish writers of her time? And how would you characterize it within that context?
Yeah. So for the first question, it was entirely serendipitous that I found her. Though I do know that other people knew that she existed. It wasn't like I discovered her out of the blue. But my process was that I was researching a footnote for my dissertation. I needed to learn something more about what free love meant for my dissertation. And so I typed the words Freie Liebe in the search box for the Yiddish Book Center. And the subtitle of Diary of a Lonely Girl is The Battle Against Free Love. And so it was the second hit in that search. And I started reading it, and I was like, wow, what is this? This is amazing. And then it became my first project after my dissertation. So it was without knowing anything about her, without having any sense that that she was important, and importantly, not knowing that she had such a tremendous treasure trove in her archive. I've been just so lucky that she kept such good records of her writing. I imagine that, like, part of what will secure her place in Yiddish literary history, so to speak, is that it's very easy to place her there because she kept such good records, and then sent them to YIVO. So doing this work that I have been doing with newspapers is relatively easy in that she left the name of the newspaper, the name of the article, and the date of when it was published. So I don't have to like go looking so hard. I just look for where she sends me, which is really, I think, unusual and extremely lucky. And I didn't know that that's the kind of writer that I had found. So that's the first question. Who is she similar to? I think she is someone who is at her best when she's being funny and kind of came into her own as a writer, first writing like jokes for the Kibitzer. And so I almost would put her in a kind of like Cutler kind of category of humor writers. Tunkler, that the kind of, although they maybe not all of them were novelists, but I feel like the tone is similar to that. And so I think that's probably where I put it. I also think she's quite similar to Yenta Serdatsky, although Yenta Serdatsky didn't write novels in the way that Miriam Karpilove, so the genres are different, but I think the concerns are similar.
This is I'm so sorry. This was just a perfect follow-up. Do you mind if I just stick this Zoom question in? Do you think she drew inspiration or even style from Sholem Aleichem or other earlier Yiddish humorists, even though they were not her gender?
That's a great question. Honestly, I think that her influences are less from maybe the Klassiker, maybe Sholem Aleichem. I think she was reading a lot in Russian. I think she was reading romance novels in Russian. And I think she was also reading quite a lot in English. And so I don't know for sure that she was reading Dorothy Parker, but she sounds a lot like Dorothy Parker to me. And so there may be some sort of connections that way as well. I don't know if Sholem Aleichem in particular is someone that I would put her alongside.
Thanks so much for this. You were talking about the fact that she wrote middlebrow literature and how that might have shaped the way that she was received in her own time. But I was wondering if her writing a middlebrow literature had an influence on the reception that your translations of her work have received today.
Yeah, I think so. I think perhaps also maybe more importantly, is what drew me to her. I was writing about middlebrow English language writers in my dissertation. And so I was that kind of was part of what I got excited about with her. I think that her writing is quite accessible and relatable for students because it's about young people and their problems, and some of the problems are very much still present. And so there's a way in which both the kind of immediacy and accessibility and humor of the novel, and that it doesn't take itself too seriously, and the topic make it something that can kind of get currency today.
So Jessica, I love this, really appreciate the overview. I've assigned some of your translations in class. So it was really kind of great to hear you read through them and contextualize them. And I noticed in the obituary that you shared that you corrected it, because in the obit it says that there was that you published 3 novels. You corrected it for 5. You've done 3. Are you going to do the other 2?
So one of them is called Brüche. It's, I think, the novel that she wrote that I've read that most closely I would call Schund. And I just don't enjoy it as much as the other ones. It is less funny, more earnest, ends in tragic death. And it's just sort of maybe not my cup of tea. And I think I felt that if I stopped at Diary of a Lonely Girl and just left it there, it would be a mistranslation in a sense. I didn't want to have the singular book sit on the shelf and for people to think, oh, Miriam Karpilove, the author of Diary of a Lonely Girl, because she was so prolific. And so I felt a sort of responsibility to immediately start translating more and make sure that people knew that she was so prolific. And that's partly what I'm doing especially with Provincial newspaper. it's Provincial newspaper and other stories. It's actually three things. It's the novella Provincial newspaper, an excerpt from her memoir about being in Palestine, the first 6 chapters, which is I think the only extant chapters of the memoir, and then 19 short stories that she published in the Forwards in the 30s. So I'm trying to kind of represent the breadth of her work. And then I think I'm done. I think I could keep translating her for the rest of my life. She was very prolific, so I could be very prolific translating her. But I think I'm ready to find the next project.
Thank you so much for this. I'm curious to hear more about the correspondence. You mentioned correspondence with other folks, other writers, cultural figures. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about what some of that correspondence was like, who in kind of the literary world she was corresponding with, and how would you characterize it?
Yeah. So she has several letters to Rose Bachelet Schomer. She has several letters to Sarah Hammer Jacqueline. There are letters to Bertha Kling. And I found a letter from Glotstein to her where later on in her life, sometime in the, I think, early 40s, where she seems to have submitted a manuscript of some kind to him to say, can you help me find a publisher for it? And he says, yes, I'm coming to Bridgeport sometime. Let's talk about it. But I don't know that anything materialized from it. So I have that's just kind of there's no prolonged correspondence with a particular literary figure. It's much more kind of scattered. But I have the very prolonged, sustained correspondence that I have of hers is with her brother and her sister-in-law. They wrote to each other maybe weekly, these long letters and postcards, very detailed. And so it helps me, I think, to place her as someone who, unlike her narrator in Diary of a Lonely Girl, who was extremely alone, this is someone who was very much surrounded by family, and she lived with them for parts of it. And so that's the bulk of the correspondence is with family members. But there are these little nuggets that give a sense of who she was reading and corresponding with.
Thanks so much, Jessica. I'm just wondering if you could put your work recovering this particular author into the context of other kinds of recovery work that's being done in Yiddish.
Yeah. So in a nutshell, in the 1990s, really, there was the beginning of a movement to translate prose fiction by women, and Found Treasures was sort of the major publication that came out of that early effort, which is still in publication today and is an anthology of short stories by women writers. Since then, there have been a number more anthologies. But I think what happened in the sort of the moment that I started translating, which is, I suppose, about 5 years ago now, was around the same time that Anita Norwich started doing quite a lot of work researching women who wrote in Yiddish as well. And she came out with her translation of Kadi Molodovsky shortly before I came out with this translation. And I'm not sure what it was that sort of sparked all of this. Ellen Cassidy also came out with Oedipus in Brooklyn before the translation of Bluma Lempel, before my translation. That's a book of short stories. And she came out with the Yenta Mash, the translation of short stories by Yenta Mash. And so there was already this kind of momentum happening when my book came out, and when I went to the press and tried to argue for it being published, I was able to say, look, these things exist, there's a market. But I think also part of what happened is that it's the result of the digitization of Yiddish literature, that all of a sudden it's much easier to find things that you maybe wouldn't have found on a bookshelf because people didn't value it or because there are fewer copies of it. And not only that, but you don't even necessarily know which things are the famous things and which things are the not famous things. If you're just looking, as I was, in a search box, right? It kind of flattens it and makes it so that you can find things that you simply like without without having to turn to someone else's assessment in order to find it. So, and also you can search by simply a woman's name, right? And then you find these writers. And so I think these things have become much more accessible. And together with that, there has been more support for translations and translators, and the Yiddish Book Center has really been instrumental with this. So my translation was the result of my receiving a translation fellowship from the Yiddish Book Center. And at the time when I was applying for the translation fellowship, I was encouraged to apply in part because they were looking for people who wanted to translate women. And so I sort of knew coming in that there was support for this, that there was excitement for it, that it was addressing a real need. And so my translation came maybe at already the kind of early end of what has been a sea change in what is available in translation that really is, I think, very fast reshaping the field of Yiddish literary study and in a really rich and exciting way. So I'm very happy to have been part of what I think is a really exciting moment.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, everyone, for your wonderful questions. And I think that's a wonderful, perfect place to end it, because it's an ending, but it's not an ending. And for those, I think particularly for those to whom this field is maybe new or not so familiar, one of the really exciting things it suggests to people, because I run into people who are outside of our field, not academics, and Yiddish has certain associations, as many of us know, and there's sort of a sense of, it's faded, it's old and dusty, and what your talk displays is that it never was that, and also that in terms of what's available to people, there is more coming out all the time. I mean, yours is literally about to come out. There are other things in the version. There's so much that has come out recently, and it's often by people who were either overlooked or neglected or forgotten or semi-forgotten, or in some cases more prominent. I mean, someone like Katia Molodowski, who was a seminal figure and recognized in her own time. So there's that whole range, and there's so much available to people to go out and discover. So I would send everyone to your library or your favorite independent bookstore and browse these sorts of things and buy lots of Yiddish literature and keep learning. So thank you again, Jessica. Thanks, everyone, and good night. That was fantastic.